called a limited scope convention, so it's limited to a specific purpose, which is one of the reasons that I have always, let me underline the word always, and consistently underline in capital letters, always opposed what's called a constitutional convention, because there is no provision in the Constitution for a constitutional convention. And that's one of the reasons, but it's the foundational reason for an opposition to a constitutional convention. But it's very important, and it seems to have escaped the notice of so many people who write on this subject, that there were actually two efforts during the Constitutional Convention of 1787, when Article 5 was being drafted, to insert the opportunity for a plenary convention to be part of the Constitution. Edmund Randolph, for instance, was the governor of Virginia. In fact, the original constitutional plan was called the Randolph Plan. And he was the governor of Virginia, and he was a member of what was called the Committee of Details. And they did the first draft of the Constitution. And in the first original draft of the Constitution, it said that amendments could be made to the Constitution by an amendment convention which had both the power to propose amendments and to adopt them. In other words, what he wrote was that we can have an amendment convention, and if you have one, the amendments can be proposed and adopted and become a part of the Constitution at this convention, and the Constitutional Convention of 1787 rejected that. They wouldn't accept a part of the Constitution that said it could be a plenary convention. And then later on, Roger Sherman also made a proposal that the Constitution permit plenary conventions for the purpose of solving whatever emergencies might exist in the Union. And the convention rejected that. So on two particular occasions, the Constitutional Convention of 1787 rejected any amendments that could be made by a plenary or unlimited convention. They only accepted what was called a limited scope convention. So the second method for amending the Constitution was this: 34 or 2/3 of the states must apply to Congress for an amendment convention. And that's important to understand, that based on the text of Article 5 and the process by which Congress can send an amendment to the states for ratification, the assumption is clear that the states must apply to Congress for an amendment convention to be called only upon the agreement of an identical text. In other words, 34 states must agree on the identical text of an amendment to be submitted to Congress. And history also supports that, because the fact is that 48 states have actually called for an amendment convention. Congress has never recognized that, nor has the Supreme Court forced them to, because we've never had 34 states ever submit the identical text, or we've never had 2/3 of the states submit the identical text for a proposed amendment convention. So there's never been a call for one. If there is a call for one, and by the way, Congress doesn't have a choice. The word is shall. It's an imperative word. If 2/3 of the states, right now we have 50 states, and contrary to what Mr. Obama thinks, we have 50 states, and that's 2/3, and if 2/3 of the states, or 34, submit to Congress for the call for a convention, and they all submit the same identical text of a proposed amendment, Congress is compelled by the Constitution to call the convention. The states at that point commission delegates to go to the convention, and that the convention must, however many, doesn't make any difference how many delegates each state sends, because the understanding is that each state will have one vote, and the majority of the states represented in the convention must approve the text of the proposed amendment. If they do, then it goes back to the states for 3/4 of the states to ratify. Just like if it comes out of Congress, 3/4 of the states must ratify the amendment as if it came out of Congress. So the question is, and this is kind of my last point here, the question is, at least I think it is, why did the framers include a state-initiated convention procedure? Why didn't they limit it to just amendments coming out of Congress? Let me propose to you two reasons. Because if Congress refused to adopt an amendment that was an urgent need by the nation, particularly one that limited the power of Congress, the states could act to initiate it. Historically, Congress has never moved to limit its own power. And so we've never seen Congress move to limit its own power, and so the assumption was that the Congress is never going to do that. In fact, George Mason, who was the leader of the Anti-Federalists, said, "We shall never find 2/3 of Congress voting or proposing anything which shall derogate from their own authority or importance." And he was exactly right. So, by the way, he spoke that in support of this process, the state-initiated amendment process. This was George Mason, who was leader of the Anti-Federalists. And the second reason that the founders proposed in a state-initiated amendment process, because it was part of what they saw as the necessary, intended balance of power between the federal government and the states. And this is one of the guarantees of that balance of power. There was a fellow named Tench Coxe, who was a widely read essayist published in journals all over the country during the 18th century, especially in the Constitutional Convention. And let me read what he wrote about that, because I thought he nailed it. This is from 1789. He said, "It must therefore be evident to every candid man that 2/3 of the states can always procure a general convention for the purpose of amending the Constitution, and that 3/4 of them can introduce those amendments into the Constitution," and I like this, "although the President, Senate, and Federal House of Representatives shall be unanimously opposed to each and all of them." Now here's the point. "Congress, therefore, cannot hold any power which 3/4 of the states shall not approve." And then he adds the words "on experience," which means in practice. So, Article 5 permits only the calling of a limited scope convention, and specifically for the purpose of proposing amendments. It does not permit a plenary convention, and states can authorize their delegates for no other purpose than the limited scope of proposing an amendment. And then states further can issue commissions allowing for the recall of their delegates if their delegates exceed the authority issued to them by their commissions, as did Massachusetts and New York in 1787. So, in my opinion, and the reason I stand where I stand on this is because I believe that protecting the power of the states to initiate an amendment to the Constitution in the absence of the willingness of Congress to do so is perhaps one of the last vestiges of the balance of power between the federal states and the government. And my enormous fear is that if we give that up, if we walk away from that, if we refuse to defend that, that we will have discarded that an incredibly insignificant and important ability for the states to exercise the power that gives them the ability to restrain an invasive, overreaching, encroaching federal government. And that's my reason for standing hard by that second process of an amendment convention initiated by the states. So, there's the premise. There's my explanation. Now, I'll be glad to entertain questions for 30 minutes.
So
28 minutes.
So what is the amendment going to be that is proposed that's so important to get it changed, inserted? What is?
Well, I mean, I could suggest some things. I don't.
I've heard balanced budget amendment and stuff like that, but.
I have too.
Well, and I think that's an illustration. I'm not aware of. I mean, I'm aware of a lot of. I mean, there have been efforts ever since we started to initiate amendments to the Constitution, and the ones that have advanced the farthest before they got to the 2/3 requirement, the Congress jumped ahead of them, and it's called contract convention.